Modern Melbourne is a series that documents the extraordinary practice of some of our most important architects and designers, and we look at their lasting impact on Melbourne. Today we are meeting John Denton. John is the founding director of Denton Corker Marshall and one of Australia's most influential architects. For 5 decades, DCM's work has shaped civic and cultural life both in Australia and internationally, from the radical contemporary statement of the Melbourne Museum to the sensitive reimagining of the Stonehenge Visitor Centre in the UK. John is a Life Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects, and in 1996, Denton, Corker and Marshall were each awarded the Institute's highest honour, the AIA Gold Medal, for an architectural body of work that is at once generous, rigorous and responsive to place, history and public life. And from 2006 to 2008, John took on the challenging role of Victoria's inaugural state architect. John, thank you so much for joining us to have this conversation. After more than 50 years as one of Victoria's most significant architects, many in our audience will know you both by reputation and also by built legacy. But when we meet someone in person, it's always interesting to understand where they come from and what has shaped them. You were born in Fiji, subsequently relocating to Melbourne, and you talk of little memories that perhaps infiltrate your perception of the world. Can you talk about some of those early experiences and whether they have impacted the trajectory of your life?
I have very few concrete memories of my first 5 years or so in Fiji, but I have 2 or 3 smells that I remember very clearly, like the smell on the beach near mangroves and things like that. Those sort of funny sorts of smells. I'm told that I have a Fijian view of the way things happen. Just say it'll be all right.
C'est la vie.
Yeah. So they're sort of containers of what I turned out to be. The other probably main influential thing that happened in my younger days was when my father decided to build a new house and had it built by his friend, the local builder, who was a friend of his, and I loved going into the office and watching the draftsman do the drawings and ask questions and all that sort of thing. And I think that was really probably the first signal of maybe what I was going to do in life. I think it was really quite influential.
Now, despite a suggestion that you'd make a good diplomat by a career advisor at school, you chose architecture as a career. Then partway through your course at the University of Melbourne, you and a couple of friends jumped on a ship from Port Melbourne and you went to Italy to undertake your own grand tour. Arguably, this is such an essential part of every architect's education. What impact did this immersion into the international culture, the history and the vibrant discourse of architecture have on you?
I think what was strongest was about the history. It was history. Travelling, you're going to look at this old building or that old building or doing this or that, and it all relates to the context of the history of architecture. But it was immensely sort of eye-opening, and it then grew from there into sort of the context of being interested in working in those sorts of places or what it might mean, what the architecture of the places meant. And I suppose that's really what was the starting point for us being interested in working overseas years later, when we had a practice of actually jumping at the opportunities to work in Hong Kong and then work across Southeast Asia and so on. So I think that was really important. The time we worked in London was more a sort of a getting into the learning about the realities of working as an architect, doing drawings, all that sort of thing.
And not just immersing yourself in the sort of architectural tourist world.
No.
Yeah.
But for anybody who knows the Architecture Association in London which was one of the hot spots for doing architecture. In my innocence, I worked away there, and when I came to leave, the partner who I was working for said, "Why don't you stay?" He said, "I can get you into the AA and you can work there, you can do that and still work here." I said, no, I'll go back to Melbourne.
I'll go home.
Yeah, I'll go home.
You went on to set up a practice in the early 1970s with two of your university friends, Barrie Marshall and Bill Corker, and Denton Corker Marshall was born. There's a lovely documentary on DCM, which I think dates from 2015 and directed by Paul Goldman, and it's called The Diplomat, the Artist and the Suit. Now that we know that you are the diplomat, an architectural practice needs so many skills. Can you talk a little bit about how you began to work together?
It was interesting because Bill and I both did a postgraduate diploma of town planning, so our whole career actually grew out of town planning and getting work from the National Capital Development Commission in Canberra. And that really had a major impact on urban design and all sorts of things in our career. So that was what sort of started it, but very quickly Barrie became involved as the sort of the visual interpreter of everything that we talked about. We'd sit around and talk. We'd like to think that we were a computer in three heads, sort of going around and round and round, and the ideas would then develop, and invariably Barrie was the one who put it down on paper.
I always got the sense it was really an exciting time. You all occupied the city, you talked about art, you talked about design, fashion and culture. You all drank a lot of coffee and probably quite a lot of wine as well.
And beer.
Beer. And as a kid who had grown up in the suburbs, it was, you were the first person I'd ever met who actually lived and worked in the CBD, but you lived in the CBD. Was that a conscious lifestyle choice that you made? And how does that kind of decision that you make on how you live impact your understanding of cities, of design and of urbanism?
I don't really know where my idea of living in the city came from, other than I think partly from travel and seeing the way cities work in Europe and other places, that it was this mix of people living in the city and working and all that sort of thing. And I think I was attracted to that. And I think that's probably what made me make that decision. The first job that, in fact, Bill and I both worked at was a practice out in Hawthorn. And we resolved that, I resolved, I don't think Bill really thought about it too much, but I resolved that we were going to have our practice in the city. We were going to be an urban practice. We were going to do work in the city and operate in the city and not operate out in Hawthorn or somewhere else. That wasn't really right for us, sort of thing. So that was a key decision that we made at the time, which I think I led or pushed for.
It's a very conscious decision, I think, to become embedded in the city where you work.
Yeah, there was a community that was diverse, and we had other people like Wood Marsh in their infancy, all sorts of people that worked for us. Lots of other people that all went on to be significant people in the architectural world. We owned another building down at the end of Niagara Lane on Little Burke Street, which was called Day's Building, and we rented out space to photographers and artists and things who lived in that, took over and lived in that space.
It was an incredibly vibrant time in Melbourne's kind of, arts and cultural life, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think
there was so much activity, so much occupation of the empty buildings around the city. It was a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, and that was really that was the life for us. That was what it was all about.
Now, DCM went on to design some of Melbourne's most recognisable civic and public interventions. Tell us about your first significant civic commission.
Well, probably the City Square, but I think that there was two other key projects that sort of started that off. Our first job we did was the pilot station at Queenscliff, And that was because Bill Corker's father was a Port Phillip sea pilot. So he'd get on the little launch and go out and climb up a ladder up the side of a big ship and then bring it up to Melbourne and then come back down to Queensland. And that was a pretty important building, and that's still there, still going strong. The second one was the City Square, obviously was really the making of us being known. Still in our youth, when we went to our first meeting with the council, one of the councillors said as we left, "Don't take any of the silverware, boys."
So how young were you at the time?
Late 20s, early 30s, I guess, yeah. But, and then the third key building for us was number 1 Collins Street, which was our first office building, our first big building, our first dealing with more than just the complexities of simple architecture, but the complexities of heritage. And that was a massive learning curve for us to get in, and part of what we learnt at that time.
In the late 90s, DCM designed the Melbourne Gateway, where the Tullamarine Freeway enters Melbourne via an experience of oversized coloured sticks and a very beautiful sound tube as well. And this was really one of the first memorable driving experiences on our roads. We see DCM's urban hand in a lot of projects. There's the Balti Bridge, the pedestrian vision of South Bank. There's the beautiful Webb Bridge that links Docklands to South Bank. Can you talk a little about some of these really important design contributions to our networks?
When I look at it, it all goes back to the National Capital Development Commission, because they were essentially urban designers in the way they worked, and we got work from them. We were young, but we'd done planning, and we got work from them doing suburbs, local centres, and then we did bigger centres, the Tuggeranong Town Centre.
So you learned to look at the city from a distance,
yes,
almost.
and learned to look at the city, and learned that the buildings that we do have to fit into the city, and the city is incredibly important. What you do with that part of it, and I think that's us learning that was really what the key to all this. Our interest in the city and the way the city works, and the opportunities for design, architectural design, to contribute to those patterns.
I think it was probably quite a new way of looking at architecture and intervention in the city at the time, I imagine.
Yes, because architects basically
they think about objects.
They're fixated at their building.
Yeah.
They design the building. They don't really think about the rest of it.
Place. Yeah.
And there's our classic experience when we did the Grollo Tower for Bruno Grollo, was that he previously had Harry Sider do a tower, and he said that Harry said to him, "Here's the tower. You can put it wherever you like."
Yeah. It's an object.
It's an object.
And it's to be looked at.
To be looked at, exactly. But to us, we looked at that to do a big tall tower. We said, no, it should be on Collins Street axis, down in Docklands, signalling Docklands, easily visible as you come in from the airport. It becomes the key marker for the new suburb, which is Docklands. That was what we told them. That's what it had to be.
Two of DCM's most important architectural commissions, I have always thought, are quite interconnected. And the first of these is the Melbourne Exhibition Centre, or Jeff's Shed, as we all love to call it. And the second is the Melbourne Museum, which is the beautiful building that we're sitting in at the moment. And some in our audience might not appreciate that one might be seen as the outcome of the other. Tell us a bit about each of these projects. Am I right? Are they connected? Whether that's in time or in architecture, there's something about the architectural language of both, to me, that's connected too.
Well, very much connected in time, and that was, I guess, that was what we were interested in doing. That was the architecture we were interested in pursuing, and they were big enough projects that you actually could do more than you might normally be able to, and they were different enough to be able to do that. So that to have this massive long shed, which we were able to put a really elegant sort of aeroplane wing type over the top of it, that ran off into the distance, and then put those sticks that just ran on and on and on. It was a really lovely thing to do, and to take the the concrete frame at the front and interfere with it and do things like we put the blade that ran back into it, which you could then see from up at Swanson Street. You then could see something down there and know that it was the exhibition centre.
So the concept of, again, an urban marker was introduced, even though I suppose you would think about that as a building in its own right, but it still has those connotations.
It had those connotations and had those references. But then with the museum following on, there's elements of that, the use of materials and those sorts of things that then do reoccur in the museum. But the museum was a different sort of story because, as you say, it was a building next to the Royal Exhibition buildings. Our urban design response was it should be a dissimilar twin. That was a building, a building from the 19th century to a building from the 20th century, and we made it such that the bulk of the museum was the same length and basically bulkiness of the Royal Exhibition buildings. The Royal Exhibition buildings had its dome, so we took that blade idea, which came from down at the river, and to make a blade that stuck up, so it created its own signal. So there was two comparable sized forms with two signals of what they each were. And then we created a context for the museum by saying, putting a grid over the top of it all and said that's a reference to the Hoddle grid. And then all the little bits and pieces of what Melbourne's like down there is replicating in a different form the idea of Melbourne as a diverse range of things.
What is quite interesting about working in the civic realm, whether it's the exhibition centre, like the sheer scale of the exhibition centre and the sheer scale of the museum as a kind of a place that holds a lot of, in the case of Jeff's Shed, a lot of important events, but it's very flexible. And in this case, some very valuable collections, but they are quite grand in scale. They do have that, I think, quite an interesting comparator. You talked with the museum about how it reflects the scale of the original Royal Exhibition building and how it becomes a companion in kind of status, if you like, and the person in this building is very small. You know, it's a civic experience stepping into a building like this.
There are buildings that have to be big, like this building, which has got 17 or 18 million artefacts in store. It's got exhibition spaces that have got to explain things to people. It's got to be big. This museum was for us, a unique time to actually change the way museums are thought about. Because when we travelled overseas and looked at the Field Museum in Chicago or the Natural History Museum in London or wherever you go to look at comparable museums, they all suffered the same problem: how to avoid fatigue, how to provide enough facilities for everybody, how do they intuitively know their way around, find their way around. We took that on and said, well, what we'll do is we'll create a galleria through the place, and that galleria will have places for people to sit, it'll have toilets and facilities, it'll have food, all those sorts of things will be part of the backdrop of what it's about. And it'll be very convenient for them. And then instead of one big museum, we'll create a series of boutique museums on the other side. And so there's effectively about 7 different boutique museums that make up this museum. So it was sort of descaling that anyway, and make it more like people coming and looking one bit and then coming back some other time and going to another bit, or coming back to re-see that bit, which was not the way museums were working. I mean, you create scale and things for its purpose, and deal with that, even though the building's big.
I've always thought we went through a period in Australia, and it probably is early 80s, where we tried to domesticate some of our civic moments.
Yeah.
And we kind of made them too domestic. And I feel that perhaps your approach to the city, the idea of a a civic gesture in the city, I do think that you recaptured that concept of the contemporary civic and dumped that idea of let's make it domestic, let's make people feel comfortable in these environments, which I always thought was an odd architecture to head for that.
Yeah.
So I think it probably relates very much to the status of doing civic or doing urban and working in the city. In 2006, you became Victoria's state architect, and you had a couple of years as an advocate in government to introduce a process of public project procurement that gave status to design. Do you have any reflections on your time as an advisor and an advocate in government? And is there really a way that good design can, for want of a better word, be smuggled into really difficult, risk-averse delivery processes?
I think it can. I mean, I was sort of fortunate in that the government architect that was created, that was the job that I took, was being pushed by Darryl Jackson and Evan Walker. Evan Walker, having been a minister, was able to be. They were the background to it.
Bless both of them for being incredible advocates for design.
Yeah, and they were the ones that pushed and convinced the government and convinced the head of Premier and Cabinet, the Secretary of Department, to create the government architect as a something, and they took that on quite seriously, so that the Secretary of the Department actually made the government architect quite senior in Department of
Premier and Cabinet.
So there was the secretary, there was two deputy secretaries, and there was me. I was the sort of fourth in the hierarchy, and the four of us each had offices together in that point. So I was interacting with Terry Moore and the secretary every day and things like that, and he would use the opportunity to ask questions. So he said, this soccer ground that they want to build is designed by Cox. It's a little bit over the top. What should we do? And I said, build it. Simple as that. And it's a good building. Do it. And he said, oh well, I better see if I can find some money. And that was literally the way it sort of worked. And it happened again with the recital centre. Now, I didn't have a great love for the look of the recital centre, but it was important. It was an important piece of architecture. And again, it was way over budget, and that Terry sort of said, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we can go back to them and try a bit harder, but you talk to the people you know that raise money for it and see if you can get a bit more money. And it went ahead. But probably the most important one for me in my time was the Children's Hospital, because the Children's Hospital was a public-private partnership, and which meant design was taken out of the hands of the government and put into the hands of the consortium that did the development. And that was troublesome. And also the minister said, can't we get an international architect for this job? It's an important job. And I heard about that and I went straight back into the system. I said, no, you can't. It's got to be an Australian architect. They've got to have an Australian architect to do it. They can do it. There's plenty that can do it.
Of course, yeah. If we mapped a graph of your life as an architect, what would it look like? I was thinking about it, and I was wondering whether it would have a pretty steep upward curve that might be described at the moment as leading to, maybe reaching an era of abundance for DCM. What are your thoughts on this? Is it about capability? Is it about capacity? Is it a reflection of political or economic conditions that you are either lucky or unlucky enough to be involved with at the time? And is it luck? Is there a bit of luck involved in it all? And I'm also interested in where you've reached on that personal graph. You've kind of reached a particular plateau maybe, where you're now in a position where you can share wisdom rather than be the person holding the pen.
Well, I think one of the key things for us is that our work pattern, almost all the main work that we've got in our whole career was competitions.
That's such an interesting observation.
Yeah.
So was it a time when competitions were obviously a preferred way of finding a design?
I think it came and went, but there was always the opportunity there. You could find the opportunity if you sort of looked, but it did come and go. But I think our trajectory was competitions and winning competitions, and that then had flow-on effect. We were the only one of two firms that got into the final for the Parliament House competition in Canberra. We didn't win, but we were one of two in the final. But out of that, the Department of
Someone in Canberra
gave us the job to design the Australian Embassy in Beijing. Oh. And out of the Australian Embassy in Beijing, we also entered a competition to design the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, which we won. Ended up having done about 27 embassy buildings around the world. We learnt from the National Capital Development Commission how to describe and sell an idea.
Yeah, that seems such an important thing.
And that's what competitions are about.
Selling a vision.
Yep.
Yep.
And we always had this thing which Barrie was very good at, was to take a sequence of drawings of ideas about how we came up with the idea and make it seem as though it was inevitable.
And it's the only answer.
The only right answer. The other part of that question is really about me. Yeah, I've reached a point where I'm old enough to sort of slow down a bit. Bill and Barrie have both retired, and I'm still a director, I'm still an equity holder, but I'm effectively a part-timer. But
You're just interfering.
Yeah, I just interfere and get in the way. But I still enjoy it, and I still see it as an important thing to participate in.
It's still on the subject of competitions, and I bring this one up because I was in the office when DCM entered the competition for the Peak in Hong Kong that was won by Zaha Hadid's office. And
we came second.
And DCM came second. And what I do remember about the winning scheme was how extraordinary it was, how it was a piece of architecture, if you could call it that. I think the competition was won with several huge paintings. And I remember it being an extraordinary moment of discussion in the office of is this a building? What is this piece of architecture? And I was going to make the observation that I felt that was a moment when DCM's architectural language shifted slightly and perhaps became maybe a little more radical, a bit more contemporary, and a bit more, a bit braver, perhaps, than what you were doing prior to that.
Look, I think it had a massive impact, and it did change the way we looked at design, particularly the sort of forms and materiality of the work. When I think about it, I think we probably went through that sort of thing 2 or 3 times.
I'm sure, yeah.
I think the original City Square competition was quite a radical thing for us, and I'm sure there's 1 or 2 others. But yeah, I think as your architecture develops, you are impacted, you are influenced. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it's not that what we did ended up looking anything like Zaha Hadid's work, but it made us stop and think and widen our view on things.
Can I ask you about the embassies?
Yeah.
You've obviously done quite a number of them, obviously in very, very different cities. And we talked a bit earlier about reading the city and about inserting into context and understanding the city that you're building in. So, in fact, that building can't really be anywhere else other than where it is. I think that's what you were getting at, that, you can't just pick up pick up that building and, share it with a different city. So did you do the same thing with each embassy?
Probably the most obvious one was Beijing, which was the first one that we did. We were given the site that was farming. It was farmland. It was very close to the centre of town, but it was outside the walls, effectively. And they designated this whole area as a future embassy precinct.
Oh, okay.
We took the idea of trying to distill some of the principles of Beijing. So Beijing has got walls around it. It's got a main central axis. It's got the most important building is at the top end of that axis, and you cross over water. And we tried to use those principles. So the Australian Embassy does all of that. It has a wall right around the outside of it. It has a moat. You cross over that on axis up to the Chancery in the distance, and which looks back down the line. And so we sort of played with creating a building which
echoed the city,
the Forbidden City, effectively, or the whole of Beijing.
Well, I suppose it's also introducing that narrative to sell a concept or a vision to someone who's probably a pretty hard taskmaster, I imagine.
Yeah. But then we then created the cross axis the other way that then linked the ambassador's residence and the sports centre and the barbecue. We put a barbecue on access down.
That's your piece of Aussie in there.
We've done sort of 3 big embassies, which is that one, and then Japan. The location of the building in Japan was a hill along the side of that main part of Tokyo. We made a decision there that we would design a building that referenced these newer buildings that were along the hillside and were different, were clearly not Japanese. We made it a building which was like the traditional embassy, which was the home of the ambassador, and coming from English context was, in fact, we took the British country house as the guide to it. So you approached it on one side and you went through and came out on the other side to gardens, sort of thing. And there was an access through the middle of it. But then we really loved working with the absolute contemporariness and skill of Japanese builders, the material, what they could do was really quite amazing. And so it was also enjoying that as well. So I think, and then the latest one, which is Jakarta, is interesting because it's just a huge embassy. I mean, it's an embassy with 700 people in it.
Much like the city of Jakarta,
just massive,
filled with people.
Yeah. But the embassy had been bombed.
That's right.
We were replacing it with a new embassy, much bigger embassy. So all of a sudden, the criteria, when we did the Japanese embassy, when we went first to visit, you could walk in and you would just walk off the street, round the side, and into the back of the ambassador's residence and say hello to the cook who was cooking lunch. No, there was no barriers whatsoever. In that time, so that's late 80s, time we did Jakarta, we're building 3 metre high concrete walls. We're setting all the buildings back 15 metres
for blast.
Because of blast.
Yeah.
And we're putting glass that's, this thick in the windows, and it's a completely, embassy, completely new world in which we're sort of seeing part of the pattern of what's happening these days.
Yeah.
You're building very heavy duty protection.
Interesting.
So things change.
What subject is taking up your thinking now? Now that you've stepped into that plateau of wisdom, is there something we should be talking about that you don't think we are?
The things that we need to keep talking about and do more of, I guess, but it's being talked about, and it's things like Indigenous design and their participation in the whole architectural scene. I think that's one area that's really important. We've been doing a lot of work where we're constantly collaborating with First Nation architects, and I think that's part of the change that we have to understand
John, thank you so much for being available to have a really fantastic conversation. I know that the audience will be fascinated by some of the insights that you've shared, and I guess it's a really important moment to acknowledge what an incredible career that you have had, and as part of DCM, what DCM has, the part that DCM has played in what Melbourne is like as a city. I think it's been an extraordinary contribution.
Thanks, Jill. I appreciate it. Yeah.